Welcome to the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. It's time to know more so you can say no more. It's time for the Clearly Christian Podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Cy Smith.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian, a podcast about what it means to see the world from God's perspective, and then the impact this has on training the next generation to live a life consistent with a biblical worldview. If you like the show, you've been listening for a while, I'd encourage you to hit the subscribe button. That'll let others know the show's worth listening to and certainly help advance the cause of Christian education. Our guest today is Mr. Dan Beckering. He's the head of school at Southwest Christian High School in Chaska, Minnesota. He's been serving in that role since 2009. He's both well-known and well-respected leader in the field of Christian education. He's also the Minnesota State Rep for ACSI, the Association of Christian Schools International. And he's certainly passionate about raising up the next generation of Christian disciples and leaders. And I know that'll be evident in our discussion today, and you're going to enjoy our time together. So we'll look forward to him. But first, let's go to school and let's set up today's show. Today, I need you to know more about education as transformation. What's really happening when you send your child off to school? On a recent podcast, I discussed that book entitled The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, which is essentially about the catastrophic mental and emotional damage done to children by what he calls underprotection in the virtual world. I made the point that even though this author is an atheist, he is a well-trained psychologist, and he advocates for giving children the right experiences at the right time as they mature through childhood. For their mental and emotional health, parents should not be letting strangers and social media formulas choose our children's experiences. And again, that's the points he makes in the book. Books like this remind us that education is a transformative experience. Children are being shaped, formed, molded by what they're learning, how they're learning it, and who they're learning it from. Their minds, hearts, emotions, all of them is engaged in the learning about life, and it will forever affect how they see the world and their place in it. Parents who think that school is just about content or what their child is learning are vastly underestimating what's actually taking place in school. Kids absorb everything around them because they're constantly trying to make sense of things. We're all wired to search for meaning and purpose. That's why they always want to know, why do I need to know this, right? We've all heard kids say that. When it doesn't make sense, kids know it. Consider this comment by a Duke University student who said this: "We've got no idea of what it is that we want by the time somebody graduates. This so-called curriculum is a set of hoops that someone says students ought to jump through before graduation. No one seems to have asked, how do people become good people?" Wow, quite telling. And then American writer Neil Postman said this: "Modern education's a meaningless hodgepodge of subjects that doesn't even put forward a clear vision of what constitutes an educated person." Listen, there's a God-designed best pattern for our lives, and when we follow the plans that He's laid out for us, we prosper into healthy people, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, even physically. For example, I recently read about a British anthropologist years ago who studied every civilization on record since the beginning of time. He found that those civilizations with a strong sexual ethic tied to traditional marriage were more productive and prosperous than those that lacked any kind of ethic tied to marriage. God knows what's best for humans because He created us. Parents have to understand the gravity of education. We call them formative years for a reason. They're literally being formed every day when they go to school. They're in the process of becoming something. To be human is to grow and to change, and this, again, is by God's design. I recently spoke to our students about this idea in chapel because Paul lays it out well for us in Romans 12, 1 and 2, which is our theme verse this year at Mansfield Christian School. Paul says, "Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you'll learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect." This is what Christian school training is all about. Information for the point of transformation. Let me make two quick chalkboard points for you to consider remembering. Number one, nothing our kids experience today is value neutral, not even school. Either they're learning about the world from God's perspective or they're not. Either way, they are learning. And if they don't learn to think like God thinks, allowing Him to transform the way they think, they will be brainwashed by the world. Children are desperately trying to make sense of the way things are. That's normal, and that's a good thing, particularly when they're getting answers that line up with God's design. Chalkboard point number 2, behavior is always the result of how we think. Good educators know this because they know that good teaching results in changed behavior. That's the whole point. God's laid out a plan for us in terms of how we grow and how we learn about the world. So when you just copy the behaviors and customs of the world, you're not using the mind God gave you to think things through from His perspective. Kids will think and behave the way they've been taught, plain and simple. And now you know more. And like I say, when you know more, you can do more. You can not only think differently, but you can act differently, and you can change, live out those convictions, and say no more if you must. So now let's put this lesson plan into action and welcome our guest, Mr. Dan Beckering. Thanks so much for being here, Dan. Appreciate you on the show.
Yeah, excited to be here, Cy. It's a big day for me. I've never been interviewed by a celebrity before, so I'm very excited.
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, again, Dan is the head of school at Southwest Christian High School in Chaska, Minnesota. Believe it or not, I just ran into one of our faculty members who said, hey, I've been to Chaska, and I think my marriage license is signed by someplace in Chaska. And I said, you're kidding.
Wow.
I've never heard of Chaska, but I know a good guy there, and I think highly of it. But has his degree in secondary education, history, and PE from Dordt College, then a master's degree in ed leadership from St. Mary's University in Minnesota, taught history, Bible, also varsity basketball coach, dean of students. Boy, you've really worked your way up through the system. Reminds me a lot of my own career as well. And we got to know each other consistently year in and year out. We end up in Washington, D.C. together on behalf of ACSI, the Association of Christian Schools International, because he's the Minnesota state rep. I'm the Ohio state rep. And we go there every year to learn about, obviously, legal issues that apply to Christian schools. And so just appreciate his leadership. But to have those positions, obviously, again, you need to be well known. You need to be well respected. And I know you are, and I know you're passionate about raising up the next generation. So it's great to have you, brother. We appreciate you joining us on Clearly Christian.
Yeah, thank you so much. Glad to be here.
All right, awesome. Well, when did you get to that point? You know, obviously you're a superintendent, and I just read your bio, so I know you came up through the system. And I don't know if you started out way back in your 20s and said, you know, boy, this is what I want to do. But when did you get to the point where you said, hey, Christian school leadership is God's calling on my life because I recognize how significant it is?
Yeah. My journey was interesting in that I never applied for or interviewed for any of the leadership positions that I ended up being chosen for here at Southwest. So, started, as you know, as a teacher, was chosen by the faculty to help a new dean of students, kind of transition into our school climate and culture. And that person on the second day of job, decided to bolt for a big job close to home in Wisconsin where he had grown up. And so suddenly I was thrust into that opportunity and enjoyed that leadership experience, and then was working under a head of school who decided somewhat abruptly to change course. And at that point, the board asked me to stand in as an interim, and 6 months later said, we really want you to do this full time. And that was 16 years ago. And our school's changed a lot over that time. It's a lot more students, a lot more programming. It's really been fun to be a part of so much of the history, to bridge the gap from when we started out in a warehouse school in the middle of an industrial park. I was the basketball coach without a gym, no facilities, to where God's brought us today. And the thing I will say that was very interesting in my early career, actually before I even started my career, I was doing student teaching, as you know, education majors do. And I was student teaching at a middle school in Iowa. I wanted to get a performance review letter of reference from the principal. Thought that's the right thing to do, get it in your what you can send to future employers. And he said to me, you won't be doing this job very long. And then I kind of took that as in, like, what, do you not think I'm cut out to teach? And he said, no, you'll be moving into leadership. And I really didn't know what to make of that when he said it to me. And now I look back and realize that, he was kind of calling something out that became really meaningful and affirming to me when these positions, became available.
Yeah. How old were you at that time when he said that?
21.
Right.
Yep, college senior. And again, I thought he was telling me I should, seek out a different career, but he was really speaking, I don't know if I'd call it prophecy, but speaking something into my life that would later on really impact my sense of God's calling on me.
Yeah. That's a great point, actually, because I hadn't thought about that, but it's probably worth noting, especially for those parents that are listening, that here this gentleman saw leadership potential in you, even at that very, very young age. And you and I do the same thing. I could probably go through my high school right now and probably pick out some that I think have great leadership potential because they're already showing that. And I think one of the great things about what you and I get to do at Christian schools is calling those kids out, even while they're under our wing in high school, and saying, hey, listen, I could maybe mentor you or at least give you opportunities to lead in high school that could really train you or shape your future 10, 20, 30 years down the road.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's one of the great blessings of being in this work.
Yeah, it sure is. And I'm not sure parents always realize that, and especially to do it from biblical worldview, right? I mean, that's
right.
Who wouldn't want their teenage son or daughter spending time with a, successful, accomplished adult that's mentoring their child from a biblical worldview? We all love that, obviously, for our kids.
Yeah, and as you know, it doesn't need to be the superintendent or head of school, right? It can be a coach, a discipleship group leader, as we have them in our school, teachers, any of the adults pouring into the life of these students can speak into them, the gifts and potential as you just explained, and that made a huge difference, in my own children's lives. As my peers here on our campus called out their gifts and potential.
Yeah, perfect. Well, they say that sociologists say culture changes about every 5 years now. I mean, it's changing so rapid. I don't think today's parents understand it. I tell them all the time, listen, school is nothing like what it was when you went to school. And I don't care if you even graduated just 10 years ago or something like that. For our youngest parents, it's totally, totally different. So you've been doing this, like you said, for a long time, and since 2009, right, in this spot. So big changes that you've seen from a head of school perspective that you can share with, people who don't live in our worlds. Is it all about technology? Is it about the culture? Is it about the parents? What really jumps out to you?
I think on one hand, the phrase "there's nothing new under the sun" is true, right? It's not like when I started teaching, 25 years ago that that kids were just radically different and we didn't have challenges. So some things I think have been true and always will be true about learning and education and working with young people. But certainly I think, two things that come to my mind is technology, both in, beautiful and very broken ways, right? The good stuff is, there's just so many opportunities for students to, in my mind, create things. I mean, we have an entrepreneurship class at Southwest where students really, literally can create applications. They can be in connection with industry in ways that when I started teaching would have been not at all on the radar, right? It would all have needed to be conceptual. And so technology has put, tools at our students' fingertips that allow for some amazing learning opportunities. And yet at the same time, we all know about technology leading to distraction and separation and loneliness and anxiety and constant comparison to others, along with all the, the secular influences that are just bombarding our students at all times. So that's been a significant change. The other thing I think is culturally, at least compared to when I started teaching, our students no longer just simply assume that what their pastors and their parents have been telling them about, God's design for marriage and sexuality, even gender, is just the way it is, right? Because they're getting such a competing, confusing message from the world that they're asking questions that students never used to ask, right? How do we know? Right, that God truly only designed marriage to be this way versus what, my neighbors across the street or my family, believes. And so I think that has become another significant challenge and yet opportunity for our kids to live like Christ in the world.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And do you think then that they're asking those questions, or they're not assuming that this is necessarily a given of what these pastors and some of these people are? Do you think that's a reflection of the culture that they're living in, that they've been kind of brought up with this idea that, hey, don't just believe what those people tell you, question everything. It may not be right for you, and that kind of just segues into my next. Do you think that's maybe the values that are out there in secular education and obviously what the world is saying to these kids, and they're bringing it then to our schools?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, for any of us, right, exposure can lead to normalcy, right? Things that we might have never even thought about being possible suddenly because of the way it's being portrayed in the media. Maybe the pressures that are being put on kids who hold to a biblical ethic, like you're a bigot. That's arrogant to think you have the corner on the truth, that your morality or your view of a way of human flourishing is the best way. That is what the students are wrestling with, right? Where, you and I had plenty of other pressures, right, when we were teenagers growing up. But I wasn't wrestling with the fact that some people were saying, what's best for humans is for them to choose their own gender after they're born. I mean, that thought never even crossed my mind. Well, it's very much in front of our students, today. And so I think I love the fact that they're asking the questions. In some way, it gives Christian schools and parents and churches the ability to help kids really ground themselves in, why do we believe this? Why would God design it this way? Versus, well, that's just what I've always been told, right? And it's never been challenged, and so I guess I'm going to go along with it, right? I think the opportunity is to really give our students convictions that hopefully will lead to, transformation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we've even said it here before. We are okay with you wrestling through those things in our schools. And that's a great place for that, because it kind of just gets back to my opening. This is what forms you, right? This is what shapes you. We want you to ask. And God certainly welcomes that. I mean, I think Francis Schaeffer said, yeah, you welcome those questions because the more you dig for truth, and if you don't stop digging for truth, that's a good thing, because you're going to find it in Christianity, and you're going to find ultimately the answers that are there. Do you think, getting back to obviously how I opened, do you think that most parents really understand this idea of education as formation? Do they really get this idea that, my child's being formed in this way? And then what's that look like in the Christian school setting? Maybe help the average listener say, yeah, this is what he means by that. Yeah.
I think if you ask most parents, whether they're Christians or non-Christians, what are your high hopes for your child's education, or what should education be accomplishing? You're gonna probably hear things like, character development and responsible citizenship and development of values. And yet, I think if we look at what's really often happening, is education is really viewed as a pathway to a successful life, right? So why do we want to have a strong high school transcript? Well, that will get you into a respected college, and that respected college will get you into a great career, which then leads to a good income, which can pay the bills and hopefully allow you to experience as much joy and maybe even luxury as you can afford. That is in many ways kind of the good life, the American dream, right? That I think so often education is boiled down to. So when that's the case, well, then it's really all about performance, right? how's school going, which means how are your grades? What college are you going to? And to be impressive, it's right, well, I'm going to this prestigious school. And then it's about, maybe, what kind of career you get. I talk to young people, you probably do too, Si, maybe even more often the parents who say, I respect so much what you're doing in education, but, I don't really want my kid to be a teacher. They're not going to make very much money, right? Now, don't get me wrong. We do want to, through education, through this whole process, help kids to be successful in their area of gifting. And I think assessment with grades and the accomplishment that comes from that, whether it's an honors or a scholarship, a future job opportunity, those are not necessarily bad things in of themselves, and they can be very important in what God wants to do with an individual. But if that's what it is in its entirety, then I think we put our kids on this trajectory of like, get on that treadmill and keep getting that little boost of, I was the best, I was successful. And what always happens, it leads to, you got to do it again, right? And if I'm not in school getting grades anymore, then I need to find my value in something else that would make me feel like I'm really good and better than others, right? Now, for Christian schools, ultimately formation is the process, and it's lifelong, the process of helping an individual become more like Jesus, right? Yeah. Like that's ultimately, the what we as disciples are seeking. We want to be more and more in how we think, how we live, how we love, what we desire, to be more and more like Christ. That type of formation should be at the heartbeat of any Christian school. And for Christian school parents, it can be difficult not to fall back into the trap of performance versus how is my kid being formed as a person.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, great point. Yeah, what can parents do then to support the school and even be intentional with this types of training? In other words, do you have any examples from Southwest where you really try to do this or you intentionally go after this? And, what a mom and dad to make of this at home? How can they help?
I think, part of it is just, what do you communicate to your own child about what's important in terms of, the questions you ask and how you interact with them when they're in school. If it's always about grades, it's always about work harder, you should be getting A's, or that if you don't, do well on this next test, that could end up hurting you in terms of your scholarships. And that will then, in the end, communicate to the student, regardless if you say, but I really care about your Christian development, it'll communicate, no, actually, mom and dad care about my performance. Mm-hmm. So it's easy for me to say that, but I'm a dad of high school kids who had expectations, seeing my students' gifts, wanting them to work hard, and I could find myself at times being trapped into, I think you could do better, right? And so that's a balancing act. And then I think in addition, just really trying to have conversations with your students about, how is what you're learning in Bible class or in chapel or in math class, how is that helping you think about life, forming you as a person? What do you think about life now differently than when you did a year ago? Those type of conversations over time with your children can really begin to emphasize that's what really matters to us, right? Who are you becoming as a person? When the school does a spiritual emphasis day and there's no class, don't take your kid out of school and do some kind of errand because, there's no class, he won't miss any, content that will hurt him on the test. They don't need to be there. That communicates something to your child.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. Even field trips. Yeah, which would show, I need to participate, but it shows, I don't know if there's anything on the field trip that's going to affect your grade. So, yeah, even at the youngest ages, you can see things like that happening. Or the parent that, a classic example as a basketball guy, I coach basketball as well. Hey, let's look at the scorebook to see how you did. right? And that'll tell us the results, right? Instead of saying, man, you played a great game. Yeah, I know you didn't have a lot of points, but you played a great game. You represented us well, great character. Hey, I liked how you helped that other guy up, or I like how you conducted yourself. And, you gave it 110%. The shots just didn't drop. Instead of saying, well, I see you were only 3 of 7 from the line. Yeah, you can do better.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think those are great conversations.
Right. I think, when a secular school talks about excellence, right? The immediate interpretation of most people is, their academics or their sports program is better than others in terms of, the amount of wins, the amount of state championships, the ACT scores, where their kids go to college. I think we can and should be, as Christian schools, pursuing all those things, but we have to have a different definition of excellence, that lines up with the teachings of Jesus. I mean, you think about Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees. I mean, the Pharisees were the superstars in terms of performance in Jewish culture. These are the best students. They are getting the best grades. They are going to the most prestigious universities. They are respected and honored for their work ethic and their minds and all of that. And yet Jesus says, I look inside you and you're not formed into the right kind of person. You're impressive on the outside. You've been very successful, but on the inside, you've been formed incorrectly. And so I think that's just a great reminder to us that, a 4.0 GPA is not always a great indicator of what kind of person is someone becoming.
Yeah. So is that why, and that was my next question, a good segue, is that why John Mark Comer, who you turned me on to, and thank you for that. I'm a little bit into that book, but I'm enjoying what I've read so far. He wrote, spiritual formation isn't a Christian thing, it's a human thing. So, what do you mean by that? And is that what you're saying? In that, hey, we're all being formed again, but you may not be formed correctly spiritually. Is that what he's saying?
Yeah, I think as best I understand it, when he says spiritual formation in that context, he's talking about the process that involves how a person is changing or developing in their character, their desires, their relationship with other people, their sense of, self-worth and what actually is meaningful in life, right? I think, if we ask anybody on the street and say, is that a good person? We typically assume right away we're not talking about how successful they are, right? We're talking about, have they developed into a person that has these type of qualities, right? That would reflect, goodness and love, kindness, humility, and we could go on, right? And we don't typically talk about that with animals, right? We don't say, is that a good animal? We're probably talking about, do they behave, that kind of thing. But there's something different about people, right? And of course, we as Christians believe it's because we bear the image of God, that we have souls that were meant to, to be eternal, right? To live in relationship with God. So I think what Comer is saying is everybody, whether they know it or not, whether they are intentional about it or not, are being shaped in who they're becoming. And that is happening by all kinds of forces around us. The people in our lives. Of course, today we talk a lot about the media in our lives, how we spend our time, how we spend our money, what we worship. All those things shape us into a specific type of people. And he goes on in that book to say, for those who want to become like Jesus, who want to be formed into Christians, that's counter formation. It's going to require you to swim upstream against all of the flow of the world. I mean, I think you mentioned in your introduction, Romans, 12. Do not conform to the ways of the world, but be transformed. And Paul is basically saying, look, the world, your flesh, the evil one, it is all taking you away from Christ. It will all push you to a place of brokenness. You have to be intentional in God's power to pursue becoming a person like Christ.
Yeah, that's exactly what I tried to tell the kids today, and I've told them this many times, that if you do nothing, and if you're not intentional about this, you can't stand still. The culture is pressing hard. So I love what John Stonestreet said. Basically, if you don't do anything, you're going to be brainwashed by the world because you are being formed. You just don't realize it, but your worldview is being shaped every day. And if you're not intentionally thinking like God thinks, then you will wake up one day to find out that, man, you look just like the world looks. You don't look any different because you've been shaped and formed, and your whole way of thinking has changed, and you just didn't even see it coming.
I think about, Jesus gives the analogy of the vine and the branches, right? When he's talking about abiding in me. And if you don't abide in me, if you're not in the vine, then you will produce no fruit. You will not become a person that reflects Christ, live like Christ, love like Christ. And so I've been thinking about that a lot for myself personally. What does it mean to abide in Christ? I can give a verbal answer asking you, Sai, about what that means, but what would that look like for me the rest of today and tomorrow to abide in Jesus? And how do we call our students to abide in Jesus so that they are being transformed rather than, as you just explained, being pushed a different way by the world?
Yeah. Well, that's a good, again, segue into my next question. That's going to take, it seems like, some discipline. And you're going to have some spiritual discipline to kind of get there. Are teens capable of that? I mean, most parents are probably like, listen, I can't get this kid to clean up his room, much less do the disciplines that you guys are talking about. So how do we build that into kids? I mean, how do we build spiritual disciplines into teenagers who, man, the stuff on YouTube or the stuff on Instagram is so much more entertaining than the stuff that, Mr. Beckering's talking about at school, which sounds so hard.
I mean, the answer is yes, and we see discipline in these high school students all the time, right? I'm amazed at the focus and work ethic and drive of so many of our students, whether it's in their sport or in class or in their pursuit of their love for robotics, right? Like these young people are capable. I mean, they're doing things in high school that I wouldn't even have thought about, right? It's really fun to see them flourish. So yes, they can be disciplined. They can also be very undisciplined, irresponsible. I think that the scary thing for me to answer your question in terms of how is, I think it starts with how we model it to them as parents and Christian mentors. And I'm not always convinced that we're modeling Christian spiritual disciplines in a way that the students will then just say, okay, that's how you live as Jesus. Because we can do a great chapel, as I'm sure you do, Sai, every time you speak. But if they're not watching your life and seeing something different than the world around them, they're not going to be very compelled by what you have to say. And so I think about that as a dad, as a head of school. How am I doing in that area, right? Like, how much time am I spending with Christ? Am I stepping away from the distractions of life? Am I being careful not to make, whether it's work or you name it, something I'm pursuing harder than I'm pursuing my relationship with Jesus? So I think that's where it starts. And then there's all kinds of opportunities in Christian schools, in all of our curriculum and content, to be encouraging students to think about, what does this have to do with your relationship with God? How does this influence how you live? This is not just about, a GPA. This is about the person you're becoming.
Yeah, well said. Great point. They are certainly capable of discipline. And no doubt about it, we
Okay.
had a girl this year who decided as a junior, I think, that she wanted to run cross country for the first time. Never ran cross country, wanted to do it, looked like fun. She ends up all Ohio on the podium at the end of the season. Never run cross country.
Man.
I mean, the discipline she went from, I think I'll try it, to the daily routines to become a state level runner, one of the top 20 in the state, all Ohio. I mean, phenomenal. It's an incredible success story, but she had to have tremendous discipline along the way. So can they do that same thing spiritually? Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. They do have such potential there. Have you read the book that I referenced in the opening there, The Anxious Generation, or have you ever heard of that book? I wanted to get your thoughts on this whole idea of, this generation, since we're talking about them, being so anxious, so depressed. He really blames it on the smartphone by and large. There's a period from 2010 to 2015, which he calls the great rewiring, where we gave teens smartphone for the first time in human history, and then we watch these terrible things skyrocket. Have you seen that in your own experience as well? Tell me a little bit about that.
I have a copy. I've read the first chapter. I'm sorry. I do have a copy of the book. My principal is reading it now. I've read the first chapter. My wife is reading it, but I have not myself, fully read the book. But I've heard enough about it to be confident that I would agree with probably most of what the author is going to say. And, we've seen this with our own students. We made the decision, about 5 years ago, to go to no cell phones in our school. Now, we had always had a no cell phone policy during the school day, except for seniors. Seniors had a privilege. They could use it during lunch and passing time. What we found is, expecting students to be carrying a cell phone on their person, getting notifications and all of those habits, and expecting them not to look at it was just foolish. I mean, how many of us as adults can carry a cell phone around and have it buzzing in our pocket and then refuse to take a look at it for hours? I mean, we wouldn't, So we adopted Yonder bags. I don't know if you heard of Yonder bags, but it's basically a little pouch with a magnet. And our students come into the school, they stick their phone in the pouch, it gets closed, and then they don't have access to their phones until the end of the school day. The magnets are put out, kids unlock them, and they go on with their day. And as you can imagine, it was not popular when we rolled it out with our students. Parents were, for the most part, excited. But what was really impactful on me and somewhat of surprise is the number of conversations I had, and most of them were with girls who came to me, and of course they came to me in private, right? They didn't want to have their peers hear it, but they said, Mr. Beckering, I was so frustrated and upset with the new cell phone policy. I just have to tell you, I have so much less anxiety during the school day. I'm more relaxed. I'm more focused. And literally, it's because they had this FOMO every time their cell phone buzzed that they were missing out on some Snapchat, something, all, as you know, pretty meaningless stuff, often leading to some level of drama. But it was just like, I got to look at it. And when everybody has their phones, no one has their phones, I should say, it just allowed them to just, be present. We had seniors that before we did this Yonder bag, you could tell which table it was seniors at lunch because they would all have their heads down in their phones.
Yeah.
Now you go into our lunchroom or go into our lobby, kids are talking, there's a loud noise, people are looking at each other, no one's on their phone. It's wonderful.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, he definitely, as you'll see, and we're working our way through it with the teachers, this book. That's what he's advocating for at the end is, hey, no smartphones for kids. I'm not sure if he's like completely out of school or not. I haven't gotten to that chapter even myself, but definitely he's even trying to get legislation passed, no smartphones prior to age 16. And some state legislatures are considering that, in their state because he makes such a good case for the damage that's being done. I told our kids today in chapel, a new poll just came out. I read about it a week or two ago, that 50% of this generation wishes that Twitter and Instagram, I think it was, or Twitter and, what's the other popular one? I think it may have been Instagram.
Instagram?
Yeah, it might have been Instagram. Two of them. Oh, no, it was TikTok. That's what it was. Twitter and TikTok. 50% said, I wish it had not been invented. And when I said that today in chapel, they all applauded. And I mean, I couldn't believe it. Yeah. So I said, obviously, to the kids, I said, well, apparently you would agree with this, correct? And they said, yeah, absolutely. And I was just blown away.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is most of those students and their parents who would applaud that will walk out of that assembly and later on that day, spend way more time than they should scrolling.
Nothing will change.
And that's the interesting thing about it, right? And we know that's the interesting thing about any type of addiction is even when you know it's wrong and not good for you, it takes incredible discipline and then like a community around you to say, hey, let's cut the cord here. I got social media on my phone, and sometimes I wonder too if I should just delete it because I'm wasting time at times as well.
Right. Well, I told him maybe there's hope because I told him today also right across my ESPN daily feed. I'm checking ESPN and it says LeBron quits social media. Says there's too much negativity and things like that. So I said, well, everybody's questioning, is this good for me? And even he is, and saying I've got millions upon millions of followers, but I am taking a break because I don't like who I'm becoming. So we all see it.
Wow.
We all see it. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of seeing things, if you're talking to families right now, and obviously you're a family with, kids in school, for those of us that are really convinced that, hey, Christian education is the best hope for America's future, what are some things that you're keeping your eye on, even as the Minnesota State rep, or a kind of big picture that, when you think of education, hey, this is probably coming, something we're going to have to think about, or, even from a parenting perspective or a professional educator perspective, what do you think's on the horizon for our field and families?
I mean, artificial intelligence, I think, is going to be the next technology that will be both disruptive. It will bring all kinds of challenges and all kinds of opportunities. And so I think Christian schools need to really lean into, developing a philosophy of how does AI fit with, the development of human beings bearing God's image. Obviously, it's a tool. So how do we use it in a way that enhances our role in God's kingdom versus, being a part of the brokenness. And I know, schools they're all over the board on that, right? Some are like, we don't want it at all. Some are leaning into it and saying this is going to be the next great thing. And so that's a big challenge. I think, school choice, I know, Ohio side, you guys are benefiting, your families are benefiting, which is great from school choice. We'd love for you to send some of that up north here to Minnesota, but I think that will be really interesting. More from what families are trying to access Christian schools and how do Christian schools, meet that demand. I still think the challenge, today is in many ways will be the same, is the same as it was, throughout time, is how do you help young people live in the world but not of the world? How do you help our students really develop a kingdom vision for their lives so that as they go into, whatever career they have and where God takes them, they see themselves as ambassadors for Christ. That's what gets you and I up in the morning to do this work. We want to see that happen. And how do we make sure we don't lose sight of that as we add new programs and again, wrestle with, okay, are we focusing on the right stuff? Are we keeping the right perspective? That kind of thing.
Yeah, well said. I couldn't agree more. This idea of building the kingdom, this idea of what is my role in that now, in terms of what am I been called to do, right? Why did God make me? Why do I exist? And where do I fit in? And being that ambassador, yeah, I love that. And knowing that, yeah, He's put you in this world for a certain reason at a certain time. So He wants you in this world, and you have great potential here to make an impact on the world that He's put you in. So you're not just throwing this whole thing away. It's a good world He created. He loves it, but it's been ruined by sin, and it can be redeemed, obviously, by His grace. And so what's your role in His story? Getting them to step back and understand that big picture. Spot on. Yeah, I love that. And maybe that's just hard with the teenage mindset because you just haven't matured through that. Maybe I'm just getting it, I feel like, and I'm 55.
Well, I mean, I think to that point, Comer in his book talks about the fact that this whole process of formation is slow. And it was actually very encouraging for me to read that, right? Because, the adults in the room, or say, recognize that, there's a lot of things that I recognize in my life that I wish I was further along, right, in this process of becoming like Jesus. And it's encouraging as we think about our own development, that it's going to continue all the way to our last breath. And for our students, right, we don't have to worry if it's not all happening now, because it won't. Right? We just need to walk alongside these kids, encourage them to begin the process, plant the seeds, and watch what God will do.
Yeah, well said. It doesn't happen fast at all, but if we can, put those things in place, that'll be those, whether it's habits, disciplines, benchmarks, self-reflection times where they can really step back and say, what we don't want is to see them 30, 40, 50 years old, and then all of a sudden they go, wow, I really wasted 10, 20, 30 years because I just didn't know what was happening to me. And now look at all the damage that's behind me. And so many adults have that story. I mean, the older you and I get, the more we see that, right? And we see these families and mom and dad say, man, I wish I didn't have to learn that lesson the hard way. And so, that's hard to hear. But you're exactly right, too, on those other points. AI, couldn't agree more. I mean, we're all studying it as fast as we possibly can because, it's probably akin to people who said, the internet will never catch on. Well, you're going to say that about AI 5 years from now, and you're going to be left way behind because they're already using it. Companies are already using it. CEOs are already using it. Obviously, I mean, it's already becoming part of mainstream. And so you're exactly right there. We got to make sure we're out and in front of it. And okay, we have created this capacity. How do we make sure that we can use this for something good, right? To generate something good. That could be a whole different show. You're going to have to come back and we'll talk about that, right? Because
love to.
Obviously, if we can cure cancer with AI, then hey, how do I sign up? And right, AI has great potential to do us all, common good for humanity, to make the world a better place. It also has tremendous potential for wrong and for lazy learning and for, sloppiness and for evil and things like, the list goes on and on. But so does everything else. Just like the internet, just like we're right back to where we started. How are we going to use this thing? What you do want, and you and I would both say this as school heads, is when AI comes to be a thing, who do you want training your child to understand AI on the ground floor? Do you want to do people from a biblical worldview, or do you want to come in on the backside where the damage has already been done and say, I wish I would have looked at it like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, that's so much of the mission of the Christian school is to develop people who have adopted a biblical worldview of all of life. So when something new comes around, they can position it, in light of the scriptures, in light of the truth, and navigate that. Right, when they're long past our schools, they're not necessarily asking our teachers, what do I think about this? Right, they've developed their own ability to think about life, through the lens of God's word.
Yeah, completely. Awesome. Well, we could talk about that and so many more issues, but I appreciate your time today, and I appreciate, your good thoughts, and I love this topic on formation. I really hope the listeners out there are really able to maybe reflect on this a little bit and then really think, like I said, that, hey, education, that is about how my child is transforming into this person that God wants them to be. And that is happening at school. Regardless of where you send them. So I appreciate you and your topic. Appreciate your heart for that. If the listener out there wants to know a little bit more about Dan Beckering, maybe they even want to know where Chaska, Minnesota is. But if they want to follow you or they want to learn more about, where do you suggest they go?
Well, I'm not a huge, social influencer like you, Cy, but, I do have a LinkedIn page, and I think I actually have a Twitter, but I'm not real active on that as well, account. But, Chaska is in the southwest metropolitan area of Minneapolis. And any families listening who are in the area and have never seen our campus, I would love for you to come out and visit. Our website is swchs.org, so you can come and learn about the school there. But I'm the kind of person I would just prefer to meet you face to face. So
that's great. Well, I appreciate you again. Thanks for that invitation. Sign me up. I want to be in that first group of people that flies out there, because I'm anxious to see Chaska. I love what I've seen on your website. It looks like a great facility. It looks like a great school, and I know you're doing great things. So keep up the good work there. And again, thanks so much for joining me today. Appreciate your kingdom building there.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. And yes, let's get that trip planned. I'd love to have you out.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you again for joining me today on the Clearly Christian podcast. And I trust that now you know more about education as transformation, what's really happening when you send your child off to school. And again, if you'd like the show, please help us spread the word by, again, leaving a review, hitting the like button, sharing it with others. That'll certainly help advance our mission in this show. And again, the only way, I say this every time, but it's true, the only way we're going to turn things around in this country is by increasing the number of people who hold a biblical worldview and live and operate every day like we do as believers. And the greatest hope we have to achieve that and to get there is Christian education. Again, I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian Education. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. Hear more episodes at clearlychristianeducation.com. If you'd like more information about Christian education in your neighborhood, or if you're interested in education opportunities at Mansfield Christian School, or if you agree with Dr. Smith and want to help him in his mission to influence and awaken Christian America, you can send Dr. Smith an email through the clearlychristianeducation.com website. Message him on the Clearly Christian LinkedIn or Facebook page, or call the Clearly Christian Connection line at 419-756-5651. This has been the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Cy Smith on clearlychristianeducation.com, brought to you in conjunction with Mansfield Christian School, a Bryan Media production.